Was not a good guy at all and was literally the worst person to grow up with. He was the meanest kid ever and would never let go of any opportunity to take on me with his friends. I was a lot smaller than him, even physically, so I could never do anything except run to my mother, and that made me look even worse because it earned me the label of a mama's boy. My mother would always reprimand him, but it didn't help because my dad would always take his side and tell my mother that I needed to learn how to play rough because that's how I would become a guy. But I didn't want to learn how to be a guy, I just wanted to live in peace. And for some reason, my dad and my brother just seemed to hate the idea of me having a peaceful life. They would constantly try to bother me one way or another. My mother would try to protect me, but there was only so much she could do because it wasn't like she could constantly keep an eye on us while also doing all the household chores. She was a stay-at-home mom, and she had a lot on her plate, what with raising us and also keeping the house in order. So it was nearly impossible for her to always prevent me from getting bullied by my brother or my dad. That's how things were for me growing up, and with time, I learned to accept it and just let it go instead of constantly complaining about it and fighting against it. Then, when I was in 8th grade, my mother sat me down and told me that she was separating from my dad. At that point, I was old enough to understand that they had their reasons and this was for the best. She didn't tell me the exact reason why they were getting divorced, but I just assumed that it must have been because my dad was a horrible guy to be married to, and she just had enough, which is why she was leaving. It wasn't until much later, when I was in high school, that I found out the real reason why she had left. Apparently, my mother had found text messages on my dad's phone between him and his secretary, and that was the last straw for her because she had been putting up with enough already, but she couldn't accept infidelity. We were having a heart-to-heart chat that day, and she told me that the reason that my dad had never liked me was because he hadn't even wanted a second child, but she had refused to give me up and had even threatened him with divorce. He was just setting up his business at the time, and they were short on money. They were already having a hard time paying all the bills, and having one child was also expensive for them at the time. Another child would be difficult to handle, but my mother put her foot down and said that she was not going to give me up and would definitely go through with the pregnancy. They did have a babysitter at the time because even though my mother was working before I was born, my mother suggested that she would continue to work and would just borrow money from her dad, my grandpa, until my dad's business took off, and then they would return everything. But my dad was not on board with the idea of taking money from his father-in-law, so he told my mother that the only way he would agree to a second child was if she quit her job and stayed at home. He expected my mother to disagree with it and delete the pregnancy, but my mother didn't do so, and that's how things started falling apart between them. My mother acknowledged that both of them could have dealt with the problem better, but the way that my father had started resenting me and harming me after I was born made her feel terrible, and that's why she never tried to reconcile with him. She told me that the fact that I had such a terrible childhood was partly her fault and apologized to me for it because she felt like she should have left sooner but didn't because she believed that it would have a negative impact on us. Unfortunately, the decision to stay in that marriage is what made things much worse, and ultimately she had to leave. But after getting hurt in the worst way possible, and part of her still loves my dad even after I was born and he had started to treat me really badly, she had held out hope that maybe he would change, but that never happened, and she was just disappointed time again. So the distance between them just kept growing, and he ended up cheating. I love my mother, I really do, but I honestly think that she could have been honest with me about a lot of things way earlier than she chose to because she only told me about all of these things when I was in my final year of high school. But they got divorced when I was in middle school, and unfortunately, I had to spend every weekend with my dad. My parents had worked out a custody arrangement where I would spend the weekends with my dad, and my brother would spend the weekends with my mom. It worked because I hated spending time with my dad, and I hated my brother even more. Update 2. My dad gave my brother $120,000 for his degree but refused to help me start my business. Now when the business is doing good he is begging me for the money that I never owed him. I had made it very clear in the divorce that I did not want to be with my dad at the same time as my brother because that would be a total nightmare. My mother agreed with it, so she got her lawyer to work out the terms. Even though my dad was not happy about it because he believed that it was important for me to bond with my brother, I thought that it was impossible for me to bond with a monster like him. So, thankfully, my mother had taken my side and worked out an arrangement where I had to spend the bare minimum of my time with my dad and my brother, and I mostly just grew up with her. But despite that, we would spend the holidays together, and that would always be terrible because after his divorce, my brother started dating his secretary, and my mother wasn't able to stand it. He had the good sense never to bring her around when we would meet for the holidays, but my mother knew the truth and she hated it. So, the holidays would always be tense, but we had to get through it somehow because my dad wanted it, and my mother had to agree because she had already put a lot of distance between my dad, my brother, and me. And this was the bare minimum that she could do, so we could still at least pretend that we were a family and were related by blood. And that is why we would try to get along, but that was just all on the surface. Deep down, none of us really liked each other, and both my brother and I had chosen which parent we liked more, and so had our parents, which is really not right. So, I guess it's safe to say that my family was pretty dysfunctional, and I had a very weird childhood. Nevertheless, I continued to stay in touch with my dad even after I found out the truth in my senior year because my mother had told me that apparently, he was the one who was going to pay for me to go to college. So, I had to be on good terms with him, and that's the reason why she had never said anything about these things beforehand because she was afraid that I would get into a fight with him and then lose my college fund. My mother had only started working after the divorce, so she had not saved nearly enough to be able to afford the kind of college that I wanted to go to. So, my dad was my best bet. It was really hard for me, but I tried my best to stay on good terms with him. It all turned out to be pretty futile though, because apparently, I never even had a college fund to begin with, and my dad continued to mistreat me and talk down to me. But a couple of months before I was supposed to graduate, a few of my friends and I decided to start our own business instead of going to college. It was a huge risk that we were taking because all of us were just 18, but we were really passionate about what we wanted to do, and we didn't think that going to college would increase our chances of getting successful quicker. It was just a leap of faith that we would have to take. I was the one who had the idea of starting our own business, and even though we were just joking about it at first, we quickly made up our minds that this was what we wanted to do. It was going to be a clothing and accessories business because we kind of wanted to revolutionize the space. Since most of the clothing and accessory stores in our neighborhood were mostly either mass-produced products from big corporations or small businesses that didn't really understand how teenagers wanted to dress and look, so my friends and I had been having a really difficult time finding stuff to wear that we could be our authentic selves in. And we got stuck wearing either really old stuff that we had to thrift or ended up looking like our dads. We had been joking about it, but it occurred to us that a lot of other people our age might have felt the same way. So, that's how our brand was born, and I'm proud to say that we have expanded considerably since then, and I'm glad that I took that risk without bothering to go to college because I think we did pretty well for ourselves. It was me and 3 of my friends who brainstormed for months and came up with a business plan. It was already decided that the 2 of us would try to design the clothes, which would not be difficult since most of us were already pretty good at art and stuff like that and were interested in fashion, and the other 2 would focus more on the business aspect of things. So, I was supposed to start looking for investors, which was going to be difficult because we were just a bunch of 18-year-old teenagers with barely any experience and no college degree. We didn't have a fashion degree, and neither did we have a business degree. All we had was a vision. It sounds idealistic, but we were stubborn and had already made up our minds. For a few weeks, I didn't tell anybody about this, but then I couldn't keep it a secret from my mother any longer, so I told her everything. She was kind of nervous about it at first and insisted that I at least go to college and get a degree, but I told her that I was really sure about this and I just wanted her to support me. So, she came around, but she told me that it would be very difficult to make my father agree to help me out with this because he already didn't like the idea of guys having typically feminine interests, and if he found out that I was dabbling in the fashion industry, he would probably never speak to me again. But I needed money, and my friends and I were being declined by every investor. Most of them didn't even entertain a meeting with us before saying no because nobody wanted to bet on us, and understandably so. The only people who would even touch our business would be friends and family, so that's who we had to rely on, and I understood that very quickly. So, about 2 months ago, before I was supposed to graduate, I decided to talk to my father about money for my business. My friends had already spoken to their parents, and everybody had agreed, albeit after a lot of pleading and begging, to invest in our business and help us out. But my dad would be the toughest nut to crack, and I already knew it. Of course, first, I had to tell him that I hadn't applied to any colleges at all because my friends and I had started working on our own brand, and that's what we wanted to go ahead with and that's what I needed my college fund money for. When I first told him about it, that I was not going to college, he didn't seem to care and said that he was fine with whatever I did. But when I told him that I would need the money from my fund to fund my startup, he told me that he didn't have any money set aside for me because he was serious, not even kidding, about not caring about what I did. That was when I found out that I never even had a college fund to begin with because everything that he had already spent on my brother who went to medical school. My brother started 4 years before me, and I knew that he went to medical school. I also knew that it would be expensive, but I figured that my dad's business was doing well, so he would, of course, be able to pay for both my brother and me to go to college. What I didn't realize was that my brother was not just taking money from my dad for school, he was also taking loads of money from him otherwise to have a fun lifestyle when he was supposed to be studying to become a doctor, and my dad was happy to help him. He told me that he had written a check to my brother around the time that he left for medical school and given him his entire life savings that he had been setting aside. It was a huge amount, almost $120,000, and he had just given it all away. Since then, he had been living off of his salary, and he didn't mind it one bit. He had also assumed that I would not be going to college, something that he was right about but for all the wrong reasons, which is why he had never bothered to save for me or even tell me that I didn't have a college fund. He explained to me that day that he just believed that Eric was his brighter son, and he had never expected that somebody as stupid as me would even bother to want to go to college, let alone get in anywhere. I had proved him right by not applying and deciding that I was going to start a business because apparently this is exactly what he had expected of me. I thought that he was kidding or something, but after a few minutes, I realized that he was being serious and he had actually given his entire life savings to Eric to spend, and he had nothing for me. I completely flipped out at him because not only was I upset that he didn't even think to set aside any money for me, he had called me stupid and had called Eric bright. That day, I finally let loose and told him exactly what I thought of him because I just couldn't take it anymore. I had expected him to help me out just a little, and I was going to pay him back once my business started making money, but he couldn't even do this much for me because he was just that selfish and hated me enough. I was inconsolable because even though I had always known that my dad didn't like me and he liked Eric way more, I hadn't seen this coming.